Good morning and welcome to the second session of our 2025 SQE virtual conference. Thank you for joining us. In case you didn't join the session or you don't otherwise know me, I'm Julie Swan and I'm Director of Education and Training at the SRA. You'll be able to catch up on any of the three sessions after today. So if you missed the first one, which was about the recently published SQE annual reports, you'll be able to watch that at your leisure. You'll also be able to watch the session that starts at 1:30 this afternoon on qualifying work experience, or QWE, at your leisure. And of course, if you enjoy this one so much, this session we're about to start so much, you'll be able to watch that again at your leisure. We'll also make sure the slides are available and they will be you'll be able to access them on our on-demand page. Sorry, that's quite difficult to say. And we'll email you a link to that page after the session. Of course, one of the benefits of joining in real time is that you can ask questions. And if you do have a question, please submit it using the link in the description below. We'll answer as many as we can at the end of the session. I should say that we won't take questions that are very particular to an individual candidate about a particular candidate's individual circumstances for reasons which I'm sure you'll appreciate. We have a feedback form, again in the description at the bottom of the page. Please use that. We very much appreciate feedback as this helps us plan sessions in the future. So in the first part of this session, we're going to look at the candidate experience and some of the changes that have been made. And we're going to address some of the questions that we most frequently get asked by candidates. And then we're going to have a deep dive into mitigating circumstance claims. So for the start of the session, I'm joined by Yanis Chrysanthou, who's Kaplan's Head of Stakeholder Engagement for the SQE, and also Tim Allen, who's Kaplan's Head of Candidate Services. And I'm going to ask Tim to come in first and to tell us a bit more about the changes to the booking process. If you joined us for the first session, you'll know that this is something that was referred to then, but we didn't go into it in any great detail. I do know that the original booking process was certainly a concern for many candidates, especially as candidate numbers started to grow. And so some quite significant changes have been made as the arrangements for booking have been overhauled. And I'm delighted that candidate feedback is now much more positive. But Tim, can you tell us a little bit more about the actual changes that have been made and how they work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Julie. We do a lot of listening. We send out the candidate surveys after every assessment. We also run the focus groups, and we received feedback to say that the past booking process wasn't working well. There was often long queues to get into the system, and then there would be a length of time where candidates had to check test center availability, which became very time consuming and stressful, and we recognized that. We introduced the use of a seat reservation form for January 2024 SQE1, and that's now become the default process for booking a seat for an assessment. Essentially, candidates indicate their preferred test and locations, their preferred date and locations, and we try to match them as best we can. There are no concerns that they will not be allocated space, as our aim is that every person that completes a form is allocated a seat. We know the system's not perfect, but it's working much better than the previous system. And we've been able to refine it after every candidate feedback session and from the sessions with the training providers. For example, we now phrase some of the questions differently to make them clearer to candidates. We've built in an automated confirmation so that candidates know that we've received their form. And we allow candidates now to make payments and complete their booking sooner, so they have the comfort of knowing they are booked sooner.
Thanks, Tim. And how do candidates access information about bookings? Where do they go?
Yeah, there's a very simple page now that tells a candidate exactly step by step what they need to go through. It's linked from originally the bookings page, and then there's the comment. There's a link to timings on that booking page, and it's in there. There's a screenshot So here we're seeing April 2025 SQE2, and there are 3 separate black banners on that page because there are 3 slightly different journeys that our candidates could go to before they get to April 2025. In that scenario, we had 2 groups who are waiting for results, and we had 1 group who are ready to take April 2025 now, so they could go straight in and book.
Thanks, Tim. And as we said, candidate feedback about the booking experience is now much more positive than it was. So thank you for explaining the changes, and thank you for the work that was undertaken by Kaplan to change the whole booking experience. I'm going to ask Yanis now to tell us a bit about some of the candidate case studies that Kaplan has published, including why you've published these.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so we published 3 candidate case studies last year in 2024, and these came about primarily from some of the focus groups where we were hearing comments from candidates about wanting more information around preparation and the experience of taking the SQE, and comments such as, it would have been nice if I'd have known this, or if somebody had told me this. So we worked with a number of candidates who kind of expressed an interest in helping us to produce those case studies, and we've ended up with 3 case studies for the time being, and we're hoping to add to these. And these essentially are their first-hand accounts written by candidates that have been through the SQE process, giving an insight into a number of key areas, which is how they prepared, how they found the experience of taking the assessments, and then any top tips or further comments they had. And as I say, they're written by candidates, but we anonymise them so candidates can't be identified. And they just kind of highlight the range of experiences for those candidates. And one of the candidates was a trainee solicitor, and another candidate sat the SQE with reasonable adjustments, and they touch upon their experiences, in particular the candidate with reasonable adjustments, how they found that process. So it's interesting to see the different perspectives, and they do comment on how they use some of the materials on the website, for example, how they use the sample questions, the resources that are available, the discussion of answer for SQE2 on the sample questions. So we just found it was helpful to get that range of experiences, and as I say, written by individual candidates themselves.
Thanks, Yanis. And another area in which more material has been released by you over the last year focuses on SQE2. Yeah. I know the SQE2 academic team have worked on more sample questions and more information to help candidates know the standard required to pass. Can you take us through that, please?
Yeah, of course. So we added 3 new SQE2 sample questions as well towards the end of last year. And these were added also by way of candidate performances. So essentially, in more direct terms, a recording of a sample candidate performance, and they were set at the level of the clearly passing candidate. So again, based on comments from candidates, comments along the lines of, we'd like more information about what that clearly passing standard is. So we focused on that, and there are 3 sample performances up now on the website for advocacy in the area of dispute resolution, and then 2 interviewing stations, 1 for wills and 1 for property practice. And for the interviewing samples, there is also written work that accompanies those, so includes the sample answer that comes for the attendance note. And I think if you just thinking back to the purpose of those samples, they essentially, as I say, give an indication of the clearly passing candidate, but it's done within the context of a realistic setting. So on the slide, there is an image from the advocacy sample assessment showing the candidate delivering their performance. And if you look at the interviewing recordings, you'll see there that they are filmed in an assessment room you can see the desk and how the room's set up as well. So it gives candidates the opportunity just to familiarise themselves with the assessment scenario as well. But the key aim is really to demonstrate the clearly passing candidate, what that level is within the context of those assessment stations. I would also say that it captures things in a different way that you can't quite capture for those oral stations in written format. So it's a different way of displaying an answer, if you like, for candidates that we've had some positive feedback on. But also each of those stations does include a written discussion of the answer. There's guidance on the key legal points by reference to the assessment criteria as well. So there's a lot of information there for candidates using both the recordings and the written work that comes with those.
Thanks, Yanis. And are there plans to publish more SQE2 sample questions?
Yes, we'll be publishing some more. In terms of timing, there'll be more information on that, details to follow later on this year. But I can probably move on now to talk about SQE1 sample questions as well, because again, we've got plans to release more sample questions towards the end of this year. We did release 40 new sample questions in November last year. So they are past questions that have been used on SQE1 that we have moved into our bank of sample questions on the website. So that's in addition to the 130 questions that are already there. And I think the key point to note for those questions, the 40 questions that were released and the 40 that were released before that, is that these are past SQE1 assessment questions that have been used in live assessments. And what we're able to do is we have got the benefit of being able to look at the question performance statistics after an assessment, and so we're able to select those questions, and we're confident that they reflect both the level of difficulty that candidates will face in the assessment. So they're represented both in terms of the level of difficulty and the length. And as I say, past questions that we've taken, retired, and added to the bank of sample questions. Those new questions that we added in November, they're split evenly between FLK1 and FLK2. So as I said, we now have a total of 170 sample questions, which are past questions from SQE1. And I think Tim in the earlier session mentioned that there's a short video that talks about the structure of an SQE1 question, and these questions follow the style because there are past questions in terms of how they were drafted. So you'll see some questions which are longer, some questions which are shorter, which is what candidates see in the assessment, and they follow the traditional structure of having a stem, or what you might call a fact pattern. You'll have the lead-in or the question, and then the five options. And as I say, there's a short video clip on our website that talks candidates through the structure or the anatomy of an SQE1 question.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Yanis. We've got a few Tims this morning, but you're Yanis. Thanks, Yanis. Yeah, worth looking at that video. And I think it's really important to emphasise, as you have, that the sample SQE1 questions that have been released over the last couple of years are past questions. They have been used in assessments. They are the real deal. We hear quite a lot from candidates who say when they get into an SQE1 assessment, they feel that the questions in the actual paper aren't the same as the sample questions, but the questions are real questions that have been used. So there's something else happening there about candidates' perceptions about those questions. Are you going to be releasing more SQE1 questions, Yanis?
Yes, so there'll be further questions towards the end of this year. So again, we'll let everybody know when they're posted, covering both FLK1 and FLK2. And I think just picking up on that point about preparation, I know there have been some questions about whether we'll be releasing a past paper. The approach we've taken, as I've mentioned, is to provide sample questions which are reflective of the assessment. They are questions which have been used in past assessments. We don't have any plans to publish past papers, but the sample questions are reflective of the level of difficulty that candidates will face. And that approach isn't unusual for high stakes assessments. Some bodies do provide sample past papers and others don't. We've taken the approach of providing sample questions which are past questions for candidates to look at. Tim's already mentioned how we do use some questions are reused, and without going to too much detail around that, that's to help with the equating and maintaining the standard of the assessment that Tim has explained in some detail. But that's the approach that we've taken. As I say, it's consistent with the approach of other high stakes assessment bodies, and as you mentioned, there will be more sample questions, which will be past questions that we'll be providing towards the end of the year.
Thanks, Yanis. Changing tack now a bit, this session is very much about information that's available, and I know you're developing a different approach to SQE news items. Can you give us an update there on what you've got planned, please?
Yes, absolutely. So as many people will know who are kind of be it candidates or involved in the SQE in some way, we do publish SQE news items regularly on the website that cover a range of issues, and we update candidates on assessment dates, when results will be published, and so on. But what we found there is that very much relies on candidates looking at the website. So what we're hoping to do in the second half of the year is introduce effectively an email alert, which will notify those that have signed up to the fact that we've published a news item and the kind of area or topic that it covers. So candidates or stakeholders can decide whether or not they feel they need to look at the news item. So it should be a better way of communicating without the need for candidates to actually check the website for the latest news, whereas effectively the news will land in their inbox and they can decide whether or not they'd like to access that. And we had some helpful comments from candidates around how that might work. So that's something that we'll be working on and should be implemented in the second half of the year.
Thanks, Yanis. I'm sure that would be a welcome change. So thanks for your contribution to the session so far, Yanis, and also Tim. We'll be seeing you again shortly, but now we're going to do that deep dive I promised on mitigating circumstances. And for this, I'm going to welcome Jackie Panter, who's Kaplan's Head of Quality and Equality. So mitigating circumstances, Jackie. First of all, what are mitigating circumstances? And what's in the policy?
Morning, Julie. I'm just checking you can hear me okay.
Yes, thank you. All's good.
Okay, mitigating circumstances. Those are issues that a candidate could not have reasonably expected and which have impacted the candidate's ability to sit the assessment at all, or may have impacted them in the assessment. The purpose of the SQE is to test a candidate's competence in legal knowledge and legal skills, and the mitigating circumstances policy sets out the grounds, the principles and the process when a candidate may not have been able to sit or something has happened in the assessment. And there are two parts to the policy. First, there has either been a mistake or a irregularity, or there's been bias or a candidate's illness or personal circumstances. And second, that those events either have or are likely to have had a material and adverse effect on the candidate's marks or performance in the assessment.
Thanks, Jackie. So can we just pick up on the first aspect of the policy, which is a scenario in which a candidate believes there's been a mistake or an irregularity in the way the assessment has been administered?
Yes, so some examples of that could be a technical issue. This is a computer-based assessment, and so a mitigating circumstance may be where there's been a technical issue where a candidate loses assessment time. or where there's been a disruption in the test room, which is outside what you would normally expect in a multi-occupancy assessment room, or noise outside the test centre, which is beyond the noise you would expect in a test centre, which is in a town or a city environment.
Thanks, Jackie. So quite a wide range of different types of events that could come under that heading of mistake or irregularity. Can we turn to the type of mitigating circumstances that might arise because of illness or personal circumstances then, please? Can you give us some examples of those types of scenario?
Absolutely. So illness such as an appendicitis, which means that a candidate isn't fit to sit one of the FLKs, or the illness has arisen between one of the SQE2 assessment days when they're scheduled to sit, or illness during the assessment. We've had unfortunate events where candidates have fainted during the assessment day. Or an example of personal circumstances could be a bereavement in between scheduled assessment days.
Thanks, Jackie. And I think it might be helpful to understand the types of events that would not be considered as giving rise to a successful mitigating circumstance claim.
Certainly. So minor disruptions during the assessment, such as other candidates moving around, or an invigilator supporting another candidate, or a delayed start to the assessment, or a candidate arriving late at a test centre due to typical transport delays, and events that affect preparation time, those would not be defined as mitigating circumstances.
Thanks. So an opportunity perhaps to reinforce the importance to candidates of checking the location of the centre and making sure they allow plenty of time to travel to the centre.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you've touched on some of the events that can happen perhaps during an assessment, but sometimes events can happen during the period when a candidate is preparing for an assessment, which might affect their readiness to do the exam, whether it's illness or family illness or bereavement. How should those be understood, that type of event be understood in the context of the mitigating circumstances policy?
Events affecting preparation time are not mitigating circumstances. If a candidate's own illness or illness of a family member or a bereavement are likely to have impacted a candidate's mark or performance, they need to carefully consider the fit to sit policy and the mitigating circumstances policy. We understand that the considerable efforts that candidates put into preparing and the impact that work and life plans may have if they're unable to sit, but events impacting preparation time are not mitigating circumstances.
Thanks, Jackie, that's clear. But what if the event hasn't impacted preparation time? The candidate is really very well prepared and is just ready to do the assessment, but something happens immediately before the assessment day. They're taken ill, or again, they have a bereavement perhaps.
Well, a claim for mitigating circumstances relating to events known about before signing the fit to sit declaration will generally not be accepted unless the candidate can provide clear evidence explaining why they attempted the assessment and signed the fit to sit declaration. The purpose of the assessment is to evaluate the candidate's competencies in legal knowledge and legal skills. And if an illness or bereavement arises, we can't properly assess those competencies. Candidates are advised to read the fit to sit policy when they book the assessment and before sitting the assessment. They're asked to confirm that they've read the fit to sit policy before starting the assessment in the fit to sit declaration. Each candidate signs the fit to sit declaration at the start of each assessment day. And in the case of SQE1, the candidate is again asked to sign the fit to sit declaration after their break in the middle of the FLK. So it's the candidate's confirmation that they know of no reasons why their performance might be adversely affected by an issue. So if they sign the fit to sit declaration and proceed with the assessment, despite being aware of those circumstances, their claim will not generally be accepted without clear evidence why they attempted the assessment and signed the fit to sit declarations.
Thanks, Jackie. So there should be no reason for a candidate not to understand the consequences of signing the fit to sit policy, and the fit to sit declaration should come as no surprise to them when they get into the assessment, because they should have seen it before. But
Yes.
do you nevertheless see examples of candidates who submit a mitigating circumstance claim despite having made the fit to sit declaration?
Yes, and they're usually rejected. The fit to sit policy is very clear.
Okay. But what if a candidate does become unwell after signing the fit to sit declaration? What happens then?
Yes, those unfortunate events occur. It's critical that a candidate informs the invigilator or a proctor as soon as possible, and certainly before leaving the assessment. And that's to ensure that there's a contemporaneous record of the issue. In the latest update to the fit to sit policy that was published in December last year, states very clearly that if a candidate wishes to submit a mitigating circumstances claim for illness or personal circumstances that arise during the assessment, they didn't report the issue to an invigilator or proctor, the claim will usually be rejected unless the candidate can provide details of exceptional circumstances explaining why the issue wasn't reported.
Thanks, Jackie. So with the emphasis on exceptional circumstances,
Yes.
the expected outcome would likely be that if a candidate signed the fit to sit declaration and something went wrong during the assessment, that they would have notified the invigilator. So there's a record of that. Thank you. So let's move on then to making a claim. How does that work?
So the candidate must submit a mitigating circumstances claim form. It's not sufficient to notify the invigilator. They must complete the claim form, which is in their candidate portal. Candidates are reminded of this at the beginning of each assessment and at the end of each assessment. It isn't sufficient just to notify the invigilator. So the MC form, which is in their portal, must be submitted within 5 working days of a scheduled FLK, or within 5 working days of the end of the SQE2 assessment window. And there's a simple flowchart, visual flowchart on the website, which summarises the process.
Thanks, Jackie. And what if they miss the 5-day deadline?
The claim will not be considered under any circumstances within the mitigating circumstances process. There is a process available to the candidate, but it isn't the MC process. In that situation, if they've missed the 5-day deadline, the candidate needs to assess whether they have grounds to submit an appeal, a first stage appeal, after the results are released. And then they will need to submit evidence to the appeals panel explaining why they were unable to submit the mitigating circumstances claim on time.
Thank you. So really important again that candidates understand they have 5 days to submit a mitigating circumstance claim.
Absolutely.
Very clearly set out on the website and a flowchart to follow through. Okay, so candidates submitted a claim. What are the possible outcomes of a mitigating circumstance claim, Jackie?
When it's accepted, the assessment attempt will be discounted, and that means that it will not count as one of the 3 permissible SQE attempts. We occasionally receive requests for the assessment board or an appeals panel to adjust a pass mark or a candidate's mark for an accepted mitigating circumstances claim, but we cannot alter candidates' marks. The reason is for the assessment's designed to evaluate the competency in legal knowledge and legal skills, which is essential to qualification to practice. And we're unable to speculate on how a candidate may have performed if the mitigating circumstances issue had not occurred. So therefore, the outcome of an accepted mitigating circumstances claim is discounting the attempt, so with just one exception for SQE2 in specific exceptional circumstances.
Okay, tell us more then about the SQE2 exemption. Or exception, sorry, it's not an exemption, it's an exception.
It is. In exceptional circumstances where a mitigating circumstances claim has been accepted for an issue that has impacted an assessment station, and statistical analysis has been undertaken to evaluate the candidate's performance over all the 16 assessment stations, Then if that statistical evaluation provides evidence that the candidate would have passed had the mitigating circumstances not impacted that one assessment station, then the candidate's overall results may be determined on 15 assessment stations instead of the usual 16, allowing the candidate to pass SQE2. And the purpose of this is to ensure fairness for candidates when mitigating circumstances have arisen and the candidate is very close to the pass mark. The provision benefits candidates where the mitigating circumstances are acknowledged to have affected the candidate and there's clear evidence, clear statistical evidence evaluating their overall performance that had that event not occurred in that one assessment station, then the candidate would have passed.
Thanks, Jackie. So you've stressed the essential features of this exception. It's where the statistical evidence makes it very clear that the candidate would, not might, but would have passed had the event not occurred in that one affected assessment station. Thank you for explaining that. So there's quite a lot about mitigating circumstances. It's all clearly set out in the policy. There's a flowchart, but what if it isn't clear to a candidate? Where do they go?
We have recently compiled frequently asked questions, and you can see on the slide some examples of those here. So these are based on the queries that have been raised by candidates. This information is on the SQE website and can be found by searching mitigating circumstances. And that information is based upon circumstances and queries raised by candidates.
Thanks, Jackie. So hopefully candidates will be able to find the answer themselves. If not, they're likely to call Tim Allen and his colleagues. And I'm going to ask Tim now to rejoin us, Tim Allen, and to tell us about some of the most commonly asked questions that you do get, Tim. Perhaps you could start by thinking about or telling us about the questions that you most frequently get in the run-up to the assessment.
Yeah, one of the most common questions we're asked are questions around exemptions. We receive exemption questions, questions around qualifying work experience, and questions around the validity of qualifications in respect of studying for the SQE. Unfortunately, all of these questions are questions for the SRA. I think there's confusion. The inquiries at email advertised on the website, inquiries at sque.sra.org.uk. That email comes through to Kaplan SQE, and there is some confusion from candidates there. So anything about qualifying work experience, exemptions, and qualifications, they're questions for the SRA. LPC exemptions as well. I think there seems to be the thought that we should know that a candidate has taken the LPC route. Unfortunately, we don't. Again, there's a pre-booking step within the SQE account. The question's very clear as to whether a candidate needs an exemption. And that's where a candidate would put their SRA number in to agree that to say that they want their exemption. So yeah, a bit of confusion around LPC exemptions as well. Regarding the booking process that we previously covered, as I said, there's a huge amount on the website now, very simple step-by-step instructions for each booking window. One of the questions we get is, well, what postcode should I use on my seat reservation form? Now, that's a very simple answer. It depends on where you want to sit. At the end of the day, we will use AI to map a candidate as close to their preferred location as they want. So if they want to sit close to home, they should put their home postcode, and we will try and get the seat as close to that home location as we can. If they have a preferred test centre, they should put the postcode of that test centre. If they want to sit close to their workplace, again, use the workplace postcode. But the postcode is very much, where do you want to sit?
Thanks, Tim. That's clear. Postcode is key. How about questions that relate to the assessment day?
Yeah, still one of the most popular questions is around ID, which is unfortunate because it seems quite a simple topic, because if you want to go on a foreign holiday, you always remember to take your passport. And similarly, we need a primary ID, which candidates use either their passport or their driving license usually, and they need to have a secondary ID as well. And the most common secondary ID is a debit or credit card that's been signed. Now, those documents need to be valid, i.e. they need to be in date, they cannot be old documents, and they need to be actual documents. They cannot be virtual documents. Unfortunately, even though there are many different methods in this day and age, we still need the hard copy actual document. So if you take both of those elements to each of your assessments, yeah, you'll have no problem at all. Unfortunately, some do forget them very late on in the process, and we are contacted very late, which causes a great deal of anxiety. There's a slight anomaly in the documents for the assessments, because we only ask for the primary document with the oral assessment. So that's only one, but I'd always recommend people just to take the two, then it's easier to remember. But hot off the press with ID, we've listened again to the candidate survey feedback. We know there's some confusion with candidates trying to remember, did they log their primary ID, which primary ID did I log on your website or on my account? Confusion as to whether it was the driving license, whether it was the passport. Well, we're taking that confusion away, and we're just accepting a primary ID on the day of the oral assessment. So you don't have to worry about what primary ID you've actually logged on the account. We are accepting any primary ID actually on the day. So we've tried to take away that confusion as well, and our website will be updated shortly.
Thanks, Tim. So any primary ID, but it has to be in hard copy in a physical form, not in electronic form.
That's it, yes.
Thank you. Before I ask you to, or invite you to step down and bring one of your colleagues in, there is just a question that's come in about the booking process. And the question is, after submitting a seat reservation form and receiving a confirmation, does someone have to wait for the request for payment to complete the booking?
Yes. Again, it's one of those great questions that are answered on our new web pages. So all of the detailers there in a 1, 2, 3 simple step-by-step approach, everything from the preparation to receiving the form to the payment. It's all there on those pages. And yes, once you've sent in your reservation form, on the screen it will say you have successfully submitted your form. You'll also receive the email confirmation, and then the next time there is contact, it will be us contacting the candidate to say, okay, then here is your you can go to your account and see your booking, and you now need to go into your account and pay. Again, those timescales are all noted within those web pages.
Thanks, Tim. That's really clear. Okay, I'm now going to ask Tim Madison, who was with us for the earlier session, to join us, because, Tim, I'm interested in the types of questions that you get about the assessments themselves.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah. So there's a couple of sort of frequently asked questions that I deal with just in this section about the assessment. One relates to the type of the multiple choice question that's used in SQE1. So the questions are described on the SQE website as single best answer questions, and on occasion we are asked whether or not our questions for SQE1 have more than one correct answer. And in short, the answer is no. The SQE1 questions will have one correct answer, and indeed the candidates are only able to select one one of the 5 options that are presented to them. And so they are referred to as single best answer multiple choice questions. Sometimes you will see in the literature that they're referred to as one best answer multiple choice questions, and sometimes you'll see them referred to as single best answer multiple choice questions. But no matter how they're referred to, those questions require candidates to select the single most accurate response based on the fact pattern that's provided to them. So the fact pattern will be obviously very specific, and that's sometimes referred to as the STEM. And importantly, the specific question being asked of them as well, and that's often referred to as the lead-in. So there is only one correct answer based on the fact pattern and the lead-in, the question being asked to the candidates. But with single best answer questions, well-drafted single best answer multiple choice questions, the incorrect options, sometimes we refer to those as the distractor options, they should be plausible. So they may be partially correct, but not correct. They may be based on common misconceptions, but again, not correct, but they should be plausible. So the answer is that there is only one correct option for the candidates to select based on the question being asked to them. But given that we do have a few of these queries, what we will do by the end of this month is we'll update some guidance on the website, specifically on the sample questions page, just to make that crystal clear for anyone looking at that.
Thanks, Tim. Other questions you get, perhaps about marking of SQE1?
Yeah, and again, we often hear queries about the scaled scoring process and whether that actually sort of changes a candidate's mark or changes their sort of pass-fail outcome. We have gone through the scaling process in quite a bit of detail in the first session today, so I'll keep this brief, but just to reiterate that there is loads of guidance both on the SQE website, but there's a great YouTube video that you can easily look up online as well on scaled scoring. But the upshot is that the scaling of the scores doesn't affect the candidates' marks. The candidates for SQE1 receive 1 mark for a correctly answered question. The scaling process simply is there to allow candidates to be able to compare their performance on the paper that they sat as against the rest of their cohort in terms of their assessment window in which they sat, but also against previous cohorts as well. So there's no change to the pass-fail outcomes as a result of the scaled scoring.
Thanks, Tim. And again, before we lose you, there's a question that's come in about sample questions and whether when you add to the SQE1 sample a bank of sample questions, whether you highlight those that have been most recently added and those which have been used in a live assessment. Can you help us with that one, please?
Yeah, sure. So the original set that were placed on the SQE website of 90, they were added first. We've subsequently released two releases of 40 sample questions, 20 for each of the FLKs. When we release them, we refer to the order in which they're released. So, but and there is some guidance on the sample question webpage that sets that out as well. But just to clarify, they're split in between FLK1 and FLK2. For both sets of questions, the newly released questions, so the ones that have been released over the last 15 months and have been used in SQE1 assessments, they run from question number 46 through to question 85. So they're the last block, essentially, in each block of the FLK sample questions.
That's helpful. Thanks, Tim. Okay, I'm going to ask Yanis now to come in and share. I know, Yanis, you have a lot of contact with candidates. You run the focus groups, which you've mentioned. We get candidate feedback. You've got your ear to the ground. What sort of questions do you get that would be useful to share?
Thanks, Julie. Yes, so there are a number of questions that are asked. One is relating to the level of difficulty of the SQE, and a typical question is, why is the SQE harder than the LPC? And the simple answer is because it's set at a higher level. It's a different exam in terms of its level, in terms of its structure, its design, in terms of its aims and how it's marked. So, it it is a completely different exam, and it is set at the higher level. So the SQE assesses whether somebody has the knowledge and skills to practice at the day one solicitor newly qualified standard, whereas the LPC was looking at whether a candidate was ready to work as a trainee solicitor before they were a qualified solicitor. So that's something that frequently comes up, and I'm not sure if candidates that have maybe taken the LPC fully understand that before they start their SQE journey. I know the SRA has published some information, in particular with the annual report on the 11th of March. There was the Stories So Far publication that did highlight this, and it's been highlighted before. So it's for candidates who are new to the SQE, it's well worth looking at those publications to get some of that information. So that's, if you like, the question around the LPC. And I took the LPC myself many years ago, and I taught on the LPC, and so I've got first-hand experience to know that these are different exams set at different levels. So that's a very common one. Another one relates to SQE1 results. So without repeating everything that Tim and Zoe covered in the first session, we are frequently asked questions around why it takes around 5 weeks for the SQE1 results to be released. And again, the simple answer is because we want to make sure that the outcomes and the results when they are released are correct, and there is a process that we follow to ensure that that takes time. About 2 years ago, we were able to reduce the time by about 3 weeks by decoupling the mitigating circumstances timeline for SQE1, and that helped to reduce the timing for results. And we have got some information on the website relating to the post-assessment processes that we follow after the SQE1 assessment takes place that tries to explain this. That's very much a summary, but what we could do is look at providing a more detailed breakdown of the timeline if candidates would find that helpful. So, for example, once an assessment takes place for SQE1, the first thing that happens is quality assuring that the data that comes to us from Pearson is full and correct. So making sure all candidates that sat the assessment have that we do have the correct data for them. So we cross-check this against the data that we hold, the EDI survey or the maximising diversity survey that the candidates complete. So cross-checking that we have the data that we expect to have in the first week, and then in the second week, weeks 2 to 4, we are then conducting all of the psychometric analysis, looking at the performance of the questions, making sure there are no issues with any of the questions that we may spot, and then the psychometricians doing that analysis, doing the EDI analysis, preparing the different reports and data, looking at the standard setting process that's been mentioned, and then preparing the pre-assessment materials, the pre-assessment board materials for the assessment board. And then we have the governance and sign-off that comes at the assessment board stage, where the pass mark is set and approved and validated, before we then have the final quality checks before results are released, and the testing to make sure everything's ready for results day. So there are, what I'm trying to say is there are a lot of steps that go into that process that do take time. Obviously, we'd like to be able to release results as soon as possible, but we have to make sure that we're going through the quality assurance steps before we get there. So we can consider maybe adding more of a detailed breakdown to kind of make it clearer for candidates, the different steps that are involved, if that would be helpful, because we are sometimes asked about that. And then from my perspective, another question is around assessment dates that we frequently hear, in particular for candidates that are new to the SQE. They do ask, when will assessment dates be published? Now, the general rule is that we aim to publish them as soon as possible, but at least a year before the relevant assessment. That does come with challenges, but we try to meet that deadline. But what we have been able to do recently is kind of get slightly ahead, and we have actually published all of the assessment dates for 2026. So that's all available on the table of assessment dates on the website. But even if we haven't published assessment dates, I would say that candidates can still get a fairly good indication of when the assessments are likely to run by referring to that web page, the timings page, because we've got some rules or principles that we try to follow in relation to those assessment dates. So for example, we've got reference to the weeks in which we aim to start the relevant assessment. So I'm just looking now for SQE1, it's the 3rd week of the month, and for SQE2, it's the final week of the month. So so there is some guidance there. So even if it's 2 years in advance and the date hasn't been published, candidates can still get a fair indication of when an assessment is likely to take place.
Thanks, Yanis. I think it's fair to say we're in now to quite a settled rhythm of assessments taking place, and then results coming out, and then reports being published. And unless we say otherwise, nothing is going to change about that. So even if the dates haven't yet been published, because we're not quite a year ahead, then you can get a really good indication of when they're likely to take place. Thanks to everybody for your questions. Don't forget, you can post them if you haven't yet. I'm going to take some questions now that have come in about mitigating circumstances. There's a question about what happens to a candidate who suddenly falls ill a few days prior to the exam. Jackie, can you take that one, please?
Yeah, yes, of course. So 2 issues. First of all, immediately consider the fit to sit policy. Candidates are asked when they book the assessment to consider the fit to sit policy, and they know in their joining instructions that they will be asked to review the fit to sit policy and sign and declare that they have read the policy before the assessment. If somebody becomes ill before the assessment, they need to consider whether they are going to be able to sign the fit to sit declaration in the assessment. If they aren't fit to do so, then rather than sitting, then they need to consider cancelling the assessment as per the terms and conditions of the booking. The cancellation charge for not sitting the assessment and cancelling immediately before the assessment is 100%. But as is set out in the T's and C's that all candidates have, in exceptional circumstances where the candidate can provide independent medical evidence that the reason for not sitting didn't relate to a pre-existing condition, and the dates of illness, then the 100% cancellation charge will be reduced down to 25% of a cancellation charge. So effectively, the candidate will receive the same refund if they cancel compared to the refund that they would receive if a mitigating circumstances claim was accepted. So to summarise, it's reviewing the fit to sit policy. Are they able to sign and declare that they are fit to sit? And if they're not able to do so, cancel the assessment so they don't lose one of those 3 attempts to pass the assessment.
Thank you, Jackie. That's very clear. I've got a question about the construction of SQE1 papers. So I'm going to go to Tim Madison on this one. The question is about how the balance of questions across the various modules is set. Are there more questions from one module than others? Tim, can you help with that one, please?
Yeah, thank you. Really good question. So the SQE1 assessment specification has some information on this. Specifically, I know it's quite a big piece of information. So it's Annex 4 of the assessment specification. There's a table there for FLK1 and there's also a table there for FLK2. And what that does is it sets out the minimum and maximum percentages of the paper relating to any particular subject area. So you'll see there that when you look at those, that the minimum and maximum percentage bands are very similar, if not the same for most of the subjects, but there are some of the subject areas where there is a lower percentage that can be included in a particular paper. So that will give you some guidance as to the proportion of questions by subject area or module as it's been described in each of the FLK1 and FLK2 papers. I think this is an SQE1 question, but in relation to SQE2, again, the assessment specification sets out which subject areas or which practice areas can be assessed for each of the different stations. So I think that's maybe a little bit more straightforward. So have a look at the assessment specifications. It's got all the detail there.
Thank you, Tim. There's a question about why an assessment centre that was once available to select from is no longer on the list of choices. I don't know who might take that.
Perhaps. I can take that, Julie.
Oh, thanks, Yanis. Yeah.
Yeah. So we do use a number of Pearson test centres across the world. The majority of them that we use being in the UK. The test centre network is not fixed in the sense that we don't simply decide these are the test centres that we use for that we will always use for the SQE. So that can change over time and has. And we look at things essentially such as the test centre availability in terms of if it has all of the required equipment and resources to allow us to use it. And it could be that over time we find that a test centre isn't quite right for us, quite right for the SQE, and that may be that it can't provide the appropriate reasonable adjustments. It may not be fully accessible or may not have the right equipment for particular adjustments. So it's making sure that it's accessible, but making sure it's of the right quality for the SQE. So that's why the network can change. We obviously do try to have a relatively fixed network, so candidates have a fair idea of where we're testing. But we also have to consider the availability of those test centres. So again, because a particular test centre was used for one sitting, because it may be used by other assessments on a particular date, it may be that it doesn't give us the availability to use it for the next sitting. So it's not a straightforward task of just fixing those test centres and using them forevermore. But what we do try to do is, as I think Zoe mentioned in the first session, is to predict where candidates will be sitting, to look at the data that we've got, the trends that we've got, and the information that we also get from training providers, and of course the use of the seat reservation form, although comes at the latter end of the process of the SQE journey for the candidate. That also gives us further insight as to where candidates would like to sit. So we try to use all of that to plan ahead in our preparations, and we do need to plan ahead, quite far ahead, in all of the predictions that we make to make sure we're securing the right test centres. But that all helps us kind of lead to where test centres will be available. And as I said, there may be a test centre that we've used in the past that, with further analysis, we find doesn't quite have the right facilities, may not be quite accessible as we would like, so we can't use it.
Perfect, thank you. So a test centre might drop off for reasons of suitability or availability for any particular setting. Thank you. We've got a question from somebody asking where to find the sample questions on the SQE website. Tim M, you've talked about sample questions. Can you come in on that one, perhaps, please?
Yeah, sure. So if you were to go to the landing page for the SQE website, so the sort of home page, at the bottom there's just 3 boxes setting out a few links. One of them is about the SQE and the other one is about assessment arrangements and results. And so if you looked at that box, there's a sub option called assessment information, and so you simply press on that and you'll see a menu there setting out where all the sample questions are contained. So homepage, assessment arrangements and results, and then assessment information, and it's all set out there.
Oh, thanks, Tim. If we can, perhaps we could put a link on this conference on demand page. We'll see if we can do that to help anybody who's having difficulty finding them. But that was very clear. Thank you. We've had a question about solicitor apprentices. We know that take-up of solicitor apprenticeships has been growing, and that solicitor apprentices have been doing very well in the performance on the SQE. But the question is whether we know anything about the government's review of funding policy for level 7 apprenticeships. The solicitor apprenticeship is, of course, a level 7 apprenticeship, and the government announced, I'm sure it was at the end of last year, that they were reviewing whether the policy that allows the apprenticeship levy to be used for level 7 apprenticeship should be changed. The answer is we don't have an update. We don't have any news on that. But I do want to be absolutely clear. The government wasn't reviewing whether level 7 apprentices or apprenticeships should continue to be available. It was the funding of the apprenticeships that was the subject of the review. We're, like lots of people I know, really keen to know the outcome of that review, and once we know it, we'll be able to talk about it, but we don't yet know about that. I'm just trying to see if there's any more questions. We've got a question about the three attempts within 6-year rule that's in place, and the question seems to be about whether candidates have an option to do a training contract. I think it's take the LPC and do a training contract, and whether or not they do will be entirely dependent upon their individual circumstances, whether the individual candidate falls within the transitional arrangement. So difficult to answer that one generally. I can't see, forgive me if I'm missing anything, but I can't see anything else. Kaplan colleagues, is there anything that you've spotted or anything that you would like to come back on before we wind up and close? Have we covered everything?
Hi, Juliet. I've seen a question. There's been quite a few coming in, but there's one relating to the sample questions. I know Yanis has talked a lot about the sample questions. There's one specifically about whether or not we provide feedback as to the reason for the correct answer being the correct answer. So I just wanted to answer that, really. I mean, at the moment, as the person who put the query in correctly pointed out, we don't. We provide a sample question, and then we provide information in terms of what the correct answer is, but we don't provide reasoning for it. Probably two aspects to that. One, it's a fairly usual approach with sample questions that provided by the assessment provider to set them out in the way we've done. But secondly, we haven't received really much feedback at all as to whether that would be something that's in demand. So I just wanted to acknowledge the question, really, provide an answer to it, but also just confirm that we'll certainly take that away and give that some thought as to whether that's something we should be doing with our SQE1 sample questions.
Thanks for spotting that question, Tim, and for answering. And another one has come in. It's about what happens if a candidate is no longer able to sit the book seat and wishes to sit at the following one. I guess that's at the following assessment window. Does that affect the next booking?
Yeah, I spotted that question just popped up there. If somebody doesn't pay for their reserved seat, if we're at the reservation stage and somebody's reserved the seat but doesn't actually pay for that seat, that has no impact on future reservations or future bookings. There's no kind of memory within the system, or that's no issue at all. If we're at the stage where somebody's actually paid for their seat and they've got their booking confirmation, they need to refer to the terms and conditions, because cancellation fees increase over time. And so there is a 14-day cooling off notice, which means somebody, when they pay for their seat, 14 days, they have 14 days of a free cancellation in essence. But as I said, after that, cancellation fees do build. So if somebody decides they don't want to sit the assessment, they do need to refer to the terms and conditions and be aware of those costs. But there's nothing in the system. There's no comeback if somebody decides to cancel or somebody doesn't decide to pay for their reserved seat, and they wish to sit the following. There's no deferral though. You can't say, oh well, I've paid for my seat, but now I want to have that seat in a future sitting. There's no deferral as such. It has to be cancelled and then a new booking made for the new window.
Thanks, Tim. That is clear and hopefully reassuring. There is a question that's come in. It's picking up on a point that Yanis raised. So Yanis said that a commonly asked question that he hears is, why is the SQE harder than the LPC? The reason is that under the LPC qualifying arrangement, the actual decision about whether somebody was competent to practice was taken by the training principal at the end of the training contract, using old terminology. And one of the two main concerns about that, of course, was whether all of the training principals, and there would have been thousands of them, were taking a decision to a consistent standard. But the other concern, of course, was that the training contract, because it played such an important part in the qualification journey, was tightly prescribed and regulated. And that was a blockage for many people being able to qualify, because it also meant that the environment in which a training contract could be undertaken had to be quite controlled, and opportunities were therefore quite limited. So we had many candidates who had done the LPC who were unable to secure a training contract and therefore were unable to qualify. With the SQE is designed to assess whether somebody is competent to practice as a day one solicitor. That means that the work experience requirement has to work less hard, if you like, because there's no judgment made about competence on the back of the work experience that an individual undertakes. So in turn, we've been able to be much more flexible about the work experience requirement. The environment in which that work experience can be undertaken is much less rigid. We're much more flexible about that than we were about the training contract, because it's not carrying the weight of that competence decision. So the LPC was assessing whether somebody was ready to do a training contract. The SQE is assessing whether somebody is ready to practice as a day one solicitor, and that's why. Oh, sorry, that is a question that's come in about now someone who's had a bereavement but didn't submit a mitigating circumstance claim. Jackie, are you able to pick that one up, please?
Yeah, of course. I'm going to make an assumption that they sat the assessment. So, as we explained earlier, a mitigating circumstances claim has to be submitted within 5 working days of the scheduled FLK if it concerned an SQE1 assessment, and within 5 working days if it at the end of the SQE2 assessment window if it concerned an SQE2 assessment window. Submitting a mitigating circumstances claim, that process is not available. There is the appeals policy, and I would suggest that the candidate reviews the appeals policy to see if they have got grounds for appeal. But the deadline to submit an appeal is 10 working days after the release of results. So it's likely, unless the candidate received the results within the last 10 days, that this particular person would be out of time to submit an appeal. So look at the appeals policy, the need to submit independent written evidence about the appeal, about why an appeal wasn't submitted in time, an explanation of the exceptional circumstances why they were not able to submit a mitigating circumstances claim. And then the appeal panel will have to consider the circumstances of the candidate sitting. In the circumstances described, the candidates explained that they experienced a bereavement, but then proceeded to sit the assessment. So they will have signed the fit to sit declaration. So as explained previously, There would need to be clear evidence about why the candidate had reviewed the fit to sit declaration and declared that there were no circumstances that would have impacted them in the assessment. So the MC process isn't available, but the appeals process is, but there are certain hurdles, there are certain tests that the candidate would need to address in the submission of what would now be a late appeal.
Thank you, Jackie. That was very, very clear. Okay, we're just about at time. I can see one final question that's come in that I will take, and then we'll wind up. So the question that's come in is about how can people find out about training options, about courses that they can take to prepare for the SQE. I can take that one. You can find details of all the training providers who've told us, the SRA, that they're offering SQE courses on our website, and you can search for them, and you can delve in and look not just at the provider but about the individual courses that they are offering. So do take a look at that if you're interested in the training options. They are many and varied, so it's quite an interesting read. Okay, I am going to wind up. I'm going to thank everybody who's contributed to today. Jackie, thank you so much for so clearly explaining mitigating circumstances. Tim Allen, thank you for sharing with us some of the insights that you've got from dealing on a daily basis with candidates' questions. Tim Madison, thank you for your contribution to this session, particularly about sample questions and how papers are designed. But can I also thank you for your contribution to the previous session, where you looked in a great detail about how the pass mark is set for SQE1. Anybody watching, if you didn't see that session and want to know how the SQE1 pass mark is set, I do recommend Tim's contribution to the previous session to you. Yanis, thank you too for sharing your insights about the feedback you hear from candidates and the information that is available for everybody to see, and also some of the changes that are coming along the line. Thank you to everybody who's posted questions. A final reminder that we would very much welcome your feedback, and that the slides from this session will be available to access on the on-demand page, and you will be able to watch this session and the previous session at your leisure. The final session from this 2025 SQE conference will start at 1:30. The focus of that session is on qualifying work experience, QWE, and you will be very welcome to join that. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.